It began in a hollow so deep the sunlight never seemed to reach the ground. Locals called it Deadwater Ridge, a name whispered with the same caution as a prayer. Hidden behind collapsing barns and rusted mailboxes was a family that time itself had tried to forget. Their faces didn't look quite right. Their voices carried the trembling echo of something ancient, something that had been circling its own bloodline for far too long. And at the heart of it all was a sister. She was born the only daughter among a tangle of cousins and brothers, all raised beneath one sagging roof that smelled of kerosene and decay. Her name was May, and for as long as she could remember, she had never known what it meant to be separate, not by walls, not by name, not by blood. In Deadwater Ridge, family wasn't a word, it was a sentence. Neighbors who passed the property on the old mining road said the family rarely came to town. Groceries were traded for game, births happened in silence, and when someone died, the hole was dug before sunrise. Generations lived and died in that same shack, their lineage twisted so tightly that it became impossible to tell where one branch ended and the next began. May was the last girl born there, and she would be the one to carry what was left of their name. By the time she turned 13, she understood the rules. Women didn't leave. They were kept close, tied to the bloodline like a fence post to barbed wire. Her mother, or maybe it was her aunt, no one was sure anymore, told her that love was family and family was survival. But May would learn that survival can sometimes be more monstrous than death. Visitors to Deadwater Ridge spoke of laughter that didn't sound human, of eyes that never looked straight, of a home where everyone shared everything, even what should never be shared. And as night fell on those forgotten hills, the cries that came me from that house weren't the cries of hunger or pain. They were something deeper, something born from the guilt of knowing that every breath they took was borrowed from their own blood. The truth about what happened inside that house was never written down, but in Appalachia, some histories aren't recorded, they're inherited. May's story begins not with her birth, but with the silence that surrounded it. No doctor ever came up that mountain road. No certificate was ever signed. She was born in the same bed her grandmother had died in, wrapped in a quilt, stitched from clothes belonging to those long gone. Her mother, pale, trembling with eyes like wet glass, whispered a name only once, and then never again. It was as though speaking it would call something back that the family had tried to bury. Her brothers, or cousins, watched her grow with a kind of dull curiosity. They never went to school, never learned to write. Their words came out slurred and uneven, as though their tongues had forgotten the shape of human speech. The few who had wandered close enough to hear them said it didn't sound like English, but something older, cracked and wrong. In that house, blood was both currency and curse. Every generation turned inward, as though terrified of letting the world in. It wasn't about love, not really. It was about control, about keeping the bloodline pure, even as it rotted from within. The elders spoke of outsiders with contempt, claiming they carried sickness and sin, but they couldn't see that the sickness had already taken root inside them. May learned early that certain questions brought punishment. She once asked who her father was. Her mother's hand struck her before the question even finished leaving her lips. Later, her brother whispered that it didn't matter, that in their family, everyone was everyone's. That night, she didn't sleep. She just listened to the house breathe, its old wheezing rhythm, like lungs filled with ghosts. As she grew older, she began to notice the sameness. The way every face in that house carried the same drooping eyes, the same crooked teeth, the same low murmured laugh. They all shared it, like a family heirloom no one wanted but could not escape. There were nights when the wind would die and the world would go completely still. Those were the nights May dreaded most, because in that silence the floorboards would creak with footsteps she knew too well, and behind her door, the doorknob would slowly begin to turn. No one ever knocked in that house, because no one ever needed to. By 16, May understood what it meant to be claimed. Not loved, claimed. Her world had shrunk to the walls of that crumbling house, a place where family meant ownership and silence was survival. There were no boundaries, no separation. The same blood ran through every vein in that house, and the same hands reached for her when the lamps went out. Outside, the forest grew thick around them, swallowing the path that once led down to town. The family said it was safer that way. No one came looking for them anymore, and they didn't go looking for anyone either. The mail stopped years ago. The world had moved on. Deadwater Ridge was left to itself, and the family became its own universe, self-contained, self-sustaining, self-consuming. May sometimes watched her brothers hunting in the woods, their movements strange, their faces marked by the same uneven symmetry, one eye smaller, one jaw longer. They didn't seem to feel pain, not the way she did. When they laughed, it sounded like something breaking. When they looked at her, it wasn't with affection. It was hunger. An old, inherited kind of hunger, passed down like a sickness too stubborn to die. The elders whispered that God had forgotten them, but May wasn't sure God had ever known they existed. Their prayers were recited in fragments, half-remembered verses that mixed the Bible with local superstition. A mirror facing a window was covered. A stillborn child was buried beneath the porch to keep the others strong. The air reeked of old rot and smoke, and yet life continued. Aimless, cyclical, unchanging. There was one photograph in the house, a faded portrait nailed to the wall, showing a man whose features looked too much like everyone else's. May used to stare at it, wondering if he'd been the first, the one who'd started it all. His eyes seemed to follow her wherever she went, pale and judging, as though he knew she carried the same curse. And then came the night she couldn't stay silent anymore, the night when blood stopped being something she shared and became something she feared. Because that night, the same door that had turned so many times before finally opened all the way. And May realized that family, her family, was about to take everything she had left to give. The screams didn't echo in that house. The walls were too thick, too soaked with history. They just absorbed the sound, as if the wood itself had grown accustomed to it. May woke the next morning with a soreness that felt older than her own body. No one spoke of what had happened. Her mother, or maybe her aunt, placed a plate of cold biscuits in front of her and whispered, "It's done now. You belong here." After that, something inside her began to rot. She'd always felt trapped, but now she was haunted. By what she remembered, and by what she couldn't. Time lost its shape on Deadwater Ridge. The sun rose, the sun set, and every day felt like a continuation of the same punishment. May stopped going outside. She stopped looking at her reflection in the rusted mirror by the wash basin. When she did, she didn't recognize what looked back. Sometimes she'd hear laughter outside her window, low, animal, and wrong. Sometimes it came from the woods, sometimes from beneath the floorboards. Her brothers had begun to change too. Their skin took on a greyish pallor, their speech grew more slurred, and their tempers shorter. One of them started sleeping in the barn, muttering to himself in a language that wasn't a language at all. There were rumors down in town. Old men at the gas station said the Ridge people had bred themselves out of humanity. Hunters spoke of finding bones in the creek bed, small and clean, as if something had boiled them first. No one dared to go near the property anymore. They said the land was cursed, that even the animals stayed away. May began keeping a small notebook, scraps of paper she hid beneath a loose floorboard. She wrote not with hope, but with desperation. She listed names, drew maps of the rooms, described what she saw each night when the house went quiet. She wanted someone to know, anyone, that she had tried to resist, that she was still human, even if her bloodline wasn't. But by the time the first frost came, the notebook went missing, and the next morning, her eldest brother was sitting at the table holding it open. He didn't say a word. He just stared at her with that same dull, ancestral stare, the kind that had no beginning and no end. "If you're still watching," the narrator's voice would say now, quiet and grave, "you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Winter swallowed Deadwater Ridge in silence. The old roof sagged under the snow's weight, and the chimney breathed thin, black smoke that smelled of burning cloth. Inside, May's world grew smaller. Her brothers rarely spoke anymore. They moved through the house like shadows, heavy, slow, unthinking. One of them had taken to sitting on the porch all night, muttering to himself, eyes fixed on the tree line as though waiting for something to come out of it. The forest, too, had begun to change. Even the crows stopped landing near the property, the dogs howled at nothing, and May could swear that some nights the wind carried voices, not quite words, but the cadence of them, like prayers spoken by the dead. The air inside the house hung thick with smoke and sickness. Food spoiled faster, candles burned shorter, the walls sweated moisture that smelled faintly of rusted iron. By then, May had stopped calling the people around her family. In her mind, they had become something else, remnants of what once was, echoes of a name long forgotten. Her eldest brother, the one who had found her notebook, began sleeping closer to her room. He would whisper to her in the dark, saying she should be grateful that she was chosen to keep the line alive. Those words carved themselves into her memory, colder than the mountain air. One morning, May found a small box placed at her bedside. Inside was a lock of hair tied with twine and a folded scrap of paper that read, "For the next one." She didn't understand, not yet, but when her stomach began to swell in the months that followed, she did. Her mother wept, though no one ever said why. The men didn't look at her the same way anymore. To them, she had fulfilled her purpose. And then, one evening near the thaw, a stranger came up the road, a young preacher from the valley, lost on his way to another town. He said he'd seen smoke and wanted to offer help. May remembered the look in his eyes when he first saw her family, confusion giving way to horror. He didn't stay long. The next day, his horse was found wandering the woods alone. His body was never recovered. By spring, the ridge had swallowed another secret, and May knew there would be no salvation, not for her, not for anyone born under that roof. The spring thaw brought rot instead of renewal. The house began to collapse from within. Floorboards sagged, beams cracked, and the air filled with the stench of mildew and decay. May's child came early, born in silence like every other before it. A girl, frail, ghostly pale, her eyes unfocused, her breath shallow. For a moment, May thought she saw something, a flicker of herself, in that tiny face. But when the baby cried, the sound didn't seem human. It was thin and distant, as if carried from another world. Her brothers didn't celebrate. They simply stared, as though the birth had confirmed what they already knew, that the bloodline was eating itself alive. The child didn't last long. 3 nights later, May woke to find her mother, or her aunt, standing over the crib, holding the baby still. The crying had stopped, forever. No one spoke of it again. After that, May began to lose track of time. Her hair turned brittle, her skin pale and hollowed. The sickness in the house spread like a contagion of the soul. One brother went mad, muttering scripture backwards until his tongue split. Another vanished into the woods one morning and never returned. Some said they heard him howling at night, long after he was gone. The family's name disappeared from county records. The shack, once hidden by trees, became more ruin than home. And when a state inspector finally came up the ridge in the late 1970s, searching for old mining claims, he found nothing but bones and silence. The house was still standing, just barely. Inside, the wallpaper was stained dark with something that wasn't water, and on one wall, written in charcoal, were the words, "Not dead, just waiting." They never found May's body. Some believe she escaped, that she wandered down into the valleys, half-mad, surviving on pity and scraps. Others say she never left, that her bones were beneath the floor, boards with the rest, but even now, the locals say that if you drive past Deadwater Ridge after midnight, you can still see a single light glowing from the second floor. A woman's shadow crosses the window, slow and searching. And if you listen closely, when the wind dies and the forest holds its breath, you might hear her whisper, not for help, not for mercy, but for silence, because some stories, once told, start to breathe again. Years later, long after the ridge had been marked as abandoned land, a new family bought the property at auction. They came from out of state, a husband, a wife, and their teenage son, drawn by the promise of solitude, unaware of what had slept there for generations. They said they wanted to live off the grid, to start fresh in the quiet of the mountains. The locals warned them, but not directly. They just said, "Some places don't want company." The first few months were peaceful. The couple cleared the brush, patched the roof, and rebuilt the porch. But no matter how much they scrubbed, the house always smelled faintly of smoke and iron. The wife said she often woke at night to the sound of footsteps in the hallway, soft, deliberate, too slow to be her husband's. The boy complained that someone whispered his name through the floorboards, and sometimes he'd find small handprints on the fogged window glass. When autumn came, the husband started finding dead animals near the woodpile. Squirrels, birds, once even a dog, each with its bones arranged neatly beside it. He buried them all, but the next morning they'd be back on the porch, arranged differently, closer. One night, the wife found a small box under their bed. Inside was a lock of hair tied with twine, brittle with age, and beneath it, a folded scrap of paper, yellowed and soft from decades of touch, the same words written in faint charcoal, for the next one. They left the ridge the next morning, no explanations. They drove down the mountain road without looking back. When a forest ranger went to inspect the property months later, he found the house empty, but the upstairs light was on, even though the power lines had been cut years before. Today, Deadwater Ridge is just a scar on an old map. Locals won't go near it. Hunters say no animals cross its boundary, and every so often a tourist will still stumble on the place by accident, drawn by stories they thought were just superstition. They'll take a photo or two, maybe even step inside, unaware of the history breathing beneath their feet. Because the ridge doesn't forget, it remembers every voice, every secret, every scream. And if you listen closely, you'll hear her still. May, the sister shared with cousins under one roof, whispering from the dark, not asking to be found, but warning you to leave.